Hello, students. Today we're going to discuss on an important poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, Crossing the Bar. Now, the biography has been displayed on your computer. That Alfred Lord Tennyson was a most renowned British poet, and he belonged to the Victorian age. He was a poet laureate of Great Britain and Ireland during much of Queen Victoria's reign, and he also remains one of the most popular British poets. So he has been awarded the Chancellor's Gold Medal at Cambridge for one of his first pieces, Timbuktu. So this is the year in which he was born, 6th August 1809, and the year he died was 6th October 1892. Some of the poems that has been written by him are Ulysses, The Charge of the Light Brigade, and many more. And some of the plays, The Foresters. And the rest of the biography has been given in detail in your textbook, so you can have a look on it. So today we're going to deal with the poem Crossing the Bar, and the theme is about death and acceptance. As you go through the poem, you may be able to have a varied number of themes, like for instance, it can be on inevitability of death, it can be on mortality, or also it can be on faith in spiritual power. All right. So in a simple term, in a simple way, I have compiled it as death and acceptance. And when you look into the form and structure of the poem has been written in a form of an elegy. It consists of 4 quatrain stanzas, 4 stanzas each, and each stanza contains 4 short lines, and the rhyme schemes are AB and AB. So this is about the form and structure of the poem. Now, the title of the poem is very important here because the title itself is metaphorical. Crossing here has various connotations, various meanings, and the poet has used the metaphor of the ship crossing the sandbar and journeying in the open sea to emphasize his idea of a soul crossing the boundary between life and death to reach the next world where time and place have no separate entities. All right. The voyage undertaken by the ship refers to the metaphorical journey of the soul after death. And at the same time, crossing also refers to the religious belief or the religious faith and devotion towards their benevolent God. So he metaphorically links this with his spiritual belief. After he has traveled far and crossed the boundary between life and death, he hopes to meet his pilot, that is referred to God, his maker face to face. Now, this emphasizes his religious devotion towards God, whom he rightly calls his pilot. Okay, and here, bar also refers to the sandbar in shallow water. Now, we all know what is a sandbar. When a ship begins her journey by crossing the sandbar in full tide out into the open sea, Tennyson, all right, who was nearing the end of his life, compares his exit to a ship's journey of crossing the bar and putting out to sea. So the sandbar here metaphorically represents the barrier between life and death. His metaphor of a voyage at sea implies his journey from life to death and beyond. So, hence, while this title becomes appropriate and it is rightly being used here as crossing the bar. All right. Now we move ahead with the text and the meaning itself. And in the meantime, I would be talking about some of the poetic techniques that has been used in this poem. All right. I hope you're ready. You have opened your text to page number 16. Now, the first stanza here, all right, sunset and evening star. sunset and evening star here actually symbolizes old age. All right. Here, sunset and evening star, the poet gives us a visual image, and it also symbolizes the old age, the end of life. All right. The nearing of the end of life. And one clear call for me here, it represents the call of death. Okay. And may there be no moaning of the bar. Now here, moaning of the bar actually is an audio image that has been presented here, and also it has been personified, moaning of the bar, the sound, when I put out to sea. All right, so we begin with this with the explanation of the poem. The beginning of the poem is very simple. It is very quiet and tranquil. As we see here, the sun has set, and taking this opportunity, the evening star is already in the sky. So we get the visual image out here. And the poet similarly is waiting likewise for his one clear call. Perhaps the speaker was nearing the end of his life, when he knows he will have to set out for journey towards the unknown. The clear call is not literal. It is just a metaphor for his belief that his end is near and he must obey the final call. All right. He hopes that there will be no moaning of the bar. He wishes to put out to sea in an untroubled state. In fact, he prays that the tide in the sea should not ebb. There should not be any disturbance when he begins his journey from the harbor. Moaning of the bar here refers to the sound water flowing up over the bar that makes a low, mournful sound. So the poet uses the metaphor of the ship here crossing the bar to indicate his impending death. His voyage from this mortal world to the next is compared to the movement of the ship, which clears the harbor, crosses the sandbar, and puts out into the open sea. And he hopes that when he will sail, there would be no ebbing of the tide in the sea because one can hear a moaning sound when the tide ebbs. However, metaphorically, here the poet thinks to be expressing grief over his departure. Okay, there should be no mourning when the time finally comes, and it also means that the poet wants to depart without any worry or anxiety. So here, the image of sunset and evening star are symbolic of his old age. One clear call that has been given here refers to the call of the inevitability of death, which he must obey. Nobody can deny it. Nobody can get away from it easily, because this is the nature of life. When he will sail to the world of the unknown, he wants to leave behind the strings that have bound him to the mortal world and face the one clear call with absolute sense of harmony and tranquility. All right. So this was explanation of the first stanza. Now we move ahead with the second stanza. As you can see, each of the stanzas it has four lines. Okay, so this is the structure of the poem. So in this stanza, you don't have much of the poetic techniques, but just the first line, but such a tide as moving seems asleep. Here, tide has been personified, all right? So as we continue with the metaphor of the sea voyage here, the poet hopes for a full tide, which is in flow and is not accompanied by any noise or violent movements of the foam. He wishes for such a tide which will be too full for sound and form. Now, sound and form collectively represents his doubts and confusions. The tide seems asleep when all that has been carried from the boundless depth of the ocean returns back out to the depth. The ship which turns again home, all right, which has been mentioned out here, the ship which turns again home may also refer to the natural course followed by it. Okay, so the departure of the poet does not affect the movement of the ship, and it continues to follow the natural movement. So the last two lines that is given here metaphorically signify the soul, all right? The soul which has come from infinite space turns again home. In a way, his final departure is not a departure at all. He does not belong to the mortal world. He is only a tenant. So he returns home again, which is the open sea. His soul is voyaging forth to be united with God. All right. So this was on the second stanza. Now, when we move ahead to the third stanza, we have some symbolism here. The twilight. All right. The twilight here symbolizes, it is a symbolism, it refers to the last moment of life. Okay. And the evening bell. Evening bell symbolizes the end of his days. All right. And here, dark symbolizes, represents death. It's a symbolic of death, represents death knell, the sound of death knell. All right. So in this stanza, he introduces the images of twilight and evening bell. This image metaphorically suggests, as I've said earlier, his old age and close of life. Evening bell announces the end of day's activities. Okay, the last sound. However, it is also suggestive of the death knell, the sound of death. He is aware of the incoming darkness. Here the poet compares the approach of death to twilight and refers to darkness that follows twilight. Darkness signifies here the eternal world of death. So the poet will make a voyage into the world of darkness at the close of his life. But when he will journey from his harbor of life, he does not want any sadness of farewell. That's what he states. People should not mourn over his departure. He wants his exit to be mirthful, means happy, devoid of grief. There should not be any grief or sadness and melancholy. That is why he states here, and may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. So he welcomes approaching of death quite naturally, unlike others who are unable to live behind their earthly ties. He does not struggle to continue his existence here anymore because he knows his time has arrived and he must obey. He just wants his farewell journey to be smooth and even. He visualizes death to be his platform to ascend to the higher life. Hence, he welcomes it cheerfully without any regrets. He wants to embark for the afterlife, leaving the mortal world behind. All right. The last stanza of this poem, we do not have much of the poetic technique except for this one, Pilot, which I have said earlier. It refers to God, his maker. All right. So here, the concluding lines emphasizes, which is very important, about his spiritual faith in the divine power. His activities in industrial, commercial, and scientific aspects has not been able to waver his faith in God. That's what he says. He knows that death will carry him far from the world of affliction and suffering. He says that this mortal world is limited to the constraints of time and place. However, the region where he is going is not restricted to these boundaries, because the reason is that death breaks down the barrier between these dimensions. It is a place where time and place have no distinct meaning. The flood is bearing him far to a world where eternity replaces transience. Once he crosses the line, he knows that there is no coming back. So crossing the bar here again signifies crossing over from the temporal life to the eternal one. The sandbar implies the barrier between life and death, which the poet wants to cross jubilantly, happily, in the hope of meeting his pilot, that is God, face to face. All right. So seeing his maker face to face alludes to the biblical idea of interacting with God. Just as the pilot of the ship determines its course and direction as he sails on a journey, he hopes to receive thorough guidance from his maker throughout his journey and beyond that. So he wants a peaceful reunion. The advancement in the post-Victorian world leading to a spiritual crisis did not affect him adversely. His faith remains firm. He will be peacefully reconciled to God in heaven, which is beyond the ravages of time and place. Now, we have talked about Victorian poets like Matthew Arnold, wherein which he had talked about loss of religious faith, and because of the lots of discoveries and inventions and writings of Charles Darwin theory. So here as well, Alfred Lord Tennyson, you know, at the end of his life, when he was nearing his death, he eventually succumbed to the religious belief that there is life after death. And that is why he feels that he would be able to sail jubilantly and happily without any trouble, without any problem. He would be able to see his maker face to face. So what happens is, what we find here in this poem, as he had written, he feels that life is not an end. This life, what he has, is not an end, because his soul will continue to travel beyond the time and place which is restricted in the mortal world. All right. And so, as he says, and may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark, he hopes that as he leaves the earth physically, there would be no sadness of farewell. When he embarks, means when he starts his journey, referring to his impending death for his next life, because he believes that beyond the world of death, there is life after death, and there where he would meet his pilot, his maker, face to face. All right. And this death will enable him to meet Almighty God, whom he rightly calls a pilot here. And he hopes to be guided and directed throughout by his pilot. Now, this is symbolic of the universal idea of keeping faith in spiritual power. He says, just like a pilot steers the course of the ship, directing it towards a definite destination, his omnipotent God will be his source of complete guidance and motivation, directing him towards the journey of life, death, and beyond. So I hope you have been able to understand this poem in a very simple and short term. This poem is very, very short. However, it has a deeper meaning, metaphorical meaning, when it comes to the title, Crossing the Bar, and its theme, because it talks about life after death and how the poet himself believes that there is life after death. All right. Thank you for watching.